Where there's smoke, there's fire. You've probably heard that saying, and usually it's just a metaphor for suspicious rumors and buried secrets. But in some of the most unsettling crimes, that old phrase turned literal. Investigators and bystanders caught the scent of smoke or saw it billowing out of chimneys or from a roadside and discovered something far more sinister. Hidden remains and horrific murders, like in the case of Chandler Halderson. He killed both of his parents, dismembered their bodies, and attempted to burn them in the family fireplace. He thought he was smart, that he would cover up his crime and everything would just become ashes. But ring camera footage showed the smoke and the flames coming from the fireplace, and his sickening deeds were exposed. Or what about the firefighters who get a call for a car fire, thinking it's the usual mechanical malfunction, and when they arrived, they saw a burning figure covered in flames walking toward them in the dark. It turned out to be 19-year-old Jessica Chambers, who was burned alive and left for dead. An unbelievable tragedy. But fire is terrifying on its own. It devours everything in its path, leaves near irreversible damage, and when it's used to erase evidence and cover up a crime, the horror only multiplies. Today's case begins in an ordinary apartment complex. Neighbors who come together for weekend cookouts, sharing their grilled meals with one another. Totally normal. Until one day, neighbors at the Red Oak Place apartments begin to notice a very putrid smell in the air. Some black smoke coming from the second-story unit, Unit 224. A resident whose balcony faced the unit where the smoke was coming from saw flames rising up from not one, but two barbecue grills. At first, sure, it was a little odd and over the top, but residents figured it would be over soon, but it wasn't. In fact, this person was grilling nonstop all day and throughout the night for days on end. That's when the awful smell really started to bother those closest to the balcony. One neighbor was disturbed by how the blaze was alarmingly close to the balcony's roof. He kept thinking, this isn't cooking, it's burning. There's a difference. That neighbor eventually called 911, but by the time firefighters arrived, the flames had calmed, and the occupant in Unit 224 assured them that everything was under control. Even the apartment's leasing agent took notice of the dense smoke and intense heat and confronted the occupant about this seemingly odd activity. Another resident who would play video games and grill out with the same individual grew suspicious after being excluded from these more intense supposed cookouts that he was having. When he asked about it, the occupant claimed to be preparing food for a wedding. And a day or so later, another tenant saw the grills, still reeking of char and being hauled off to a nearby trash bin. It left the entire complex on edge. They were dreading to find out the unsettling truth behind those relentless flames, but since it stopped and the authorities seemed to clear the occupant of anything suspicious, everyone seemed to just let it go and move on. But soon this mundane apartment setting transformed into a chilling crime scene, unraveling exactly why, where there's smoke, there's fire. Because it became more than just a cliche. It became the catalyst for uncovering a horrific murder. Hi everyone, and welcome back to my channel. And if you have never been here before, I'm Kimbyrleigha. It's nice to finally meet you. Don't forget to subscribe and like this video if it is your first time here, or if you just haven't subscribed yet. It really helps me and my channel out. Today I'm going to be taking you to Houston, Texas, and as a matter of fact, every week we go on a journey to a new place. And speaking of taking you on these journeys, have you ever stepped into the mysterious world of June Parker? She's a sharp-witted detective with a knack for uncovering the truth in June's Journey, which is a captivating, free-to-download hidden object mystery game set in the dazzling backdrop of the 1920s. And June's Journey is kindly sponsoring my video today. And there's something new and exciting that I'm about to tell you. So even if you've heard about June's Journey before, I've got a little something special coming to challenge the detective in all of you. In the story, tragedy strikes, and June is thrust into a thrilling investigation to solve her sister Claire's murder, as she uncovers long-buried secrets within her own family. And if you like solving crimes, you will love it. But that's just part of the adventure. From high society parties to shadowy alleyways, June finds herself entangled in puzzling situations, using her keen intellect and charm to help friends in need, all while staying one step ahead of danger. With each new scene, the mystery deepens. There's a brand new trailer that I'm about to share with you, and it's action-packed and mysterious.
Don't do anything rash, Miss Parker.
June's Journey. Play now.
June's Journey takes you on an emotional adventure filled with love, betrayal, family drama, and social injustice. With new chapters being released every week, there's always a fresh mystery to solve and new layers to uncover. June isn't your typical detective either. She has no badge, no forensics lab, and no access to police files. Instead, she relies on her intuition, social intelligence, and quick thinking to crack the toughest cases. She's a lot like you and I, so why don't you try it? It's going to be your turn. I want you to try to investigate. Are you ready? In this crime scene that I'm showing you on the screen, there's a crucial clue right in front of you. Can you spot it? Here's a riddle to help you. If the letter J equals 10 and the letter P equals 16, then what do the numbers 6, 15, 15, 20, 16, 18, 9, 14, and 20 mean? I'm going to pause the screen so you can figure it out. Then leave your guess in the comments. Don't cheat, and I'm going to see who got it first. To find the answer, you're going to have to wait till the end of the video. If you want to continue solving the mystery, download June's Journey for free on iOS, Android, or PC by using my special link below or scanning the QR code on the screen. And thank you so much to June's Journey for sponsoring today's video. I want you to imagine for a second that you are a 19-year-old. You're home from spring break. You're excited for a week of fun, catching up with friends, and most importantly, getting ready to see Beyoncé live. It's supposed to be the best night ever. You're texting your friends, you're making plans, you're getting your hair done, just normal teenage girl things. But then out of nowhere, you stop replying. Your phone goes silent. Your best friends, they don't hear from you. Your mom, you never miss a check-in, but you're not answering. Your college professors, well, you don't even show up for class. It's as though you just vanished. Your family knows something is wrong. You would never disappear like this. You're a girl who has everything planned, the one who never leaves anyone hanging. But when they go to the last place you were seen, your ex-boyfriend's apartment, he says, oh yeah, she was here, but she left last night on foot. And that is when the real nightmare begins. Because one by one, the red flags start stacking up. A fire in an apartment, neighbors noticing an awful smell, the bathtub running non-stop, the garbage disposal running for hours. And then there were those barbecue grills, the ones that were being used non-stop for days. By the time police start putting the pieces together, it's much too late. What started as a missing persons case has become something far worse. Something so unthinkable that even seasoned detectives would later say they'd never seen anything like it. This is the disturbing and tragic case of Tynesha Stewart. Before we get into the nightmare that unfolded, let's talk about who Tynesha really was, because she wasn't just a victim in a true crime story. She was a daughter, a sister, a best friend, and a young woman with big dreams. Tynesha Devonna Stewart was born on July 10th of 1987 to her mother, Gail Shields, and her childhood wasn't perfect. Her parents divorced when she was young, and when she was just 6 years old, she faced her very first heartbreak. Her father passed away from an aneurysm. It was a loss that no child should have to go through. But even then, Tynesha was resilient. She grew up in Bordersville, Texas, a tight-knit Black community filled with small businesses and deep cultural roots. The kind of place where family isn't just blood, it's the people who surround you. Tynesha was the fourth of 6 children, and she had a personality that stood out. Her older sister, Gayla, described her as the girly girl of the family, organized, meticulous, and always put together. Gayla, on the other hand, was laid back and not so much into girly things, so in a way, they balanced each other out. But beneath all of that, Tynesha struggled with something that a lot of young girls do: insecurity. She often compared herself to others, wondering if she measured up. But here's the thing, Tynesha didn't let those insecurities define her. She transformed them into confidence. She became the kind of girl who set her goals and then crushed them. She had big dreams, and she was determined to make something of herself. She loved music, and I mean, she really, really loved music. Growing up in Houston during the rise of Destiny's Child, she and her friends started their own girl group called 4-Part Harmony. Tynesha didn't just like singing, she was extremely talented. She had a voice that would fill up a room, and people described her voice as powerful, rich, and impossible to ignore. Kind of like her presence. It was magnetic. People were just drawn to her. not just because she was talented and beautiful, but because she was kind, funny, and full of life. She was also an overachiever. When it came to school, Tynesha took her studies very seriously. She attended Nimitz High School, the same school as some really big names, like her uncles, Jason and Aaron Glenn, both of whom played in the NFL. Jason was a linebacker for the Minnesota Vikings, and Aaron was a defensive back for the Dallas Cowboys. Talent ran in their family. The school had a history of producing top-tier athletes, including Major League Baseball player Michael Bourne and WNBA star Brittany Griner. But sports, not for Tynesha. She wasn't about the sweaty life. She said it herself when Coach Debbie Jackson asked her, "Why don't you try out?" Her answer, "I don't like to sweat." Instead, she took on a managerial role for the basketball team. And even though she wasn't on the court, she was running the show behind the scenes, keeping everything organized and under control, which was completely aligned with her personality traits. And when she wasn't managing the team, she was stealing the spotlight in another way by singing the national anthem at games. You could just picture the packed gym, a hush falling over the crowd before the game started, and then Tynesha's voice filling the air. She wasn't just involved, she was everywhere. She was a high achiever, balancing honor courses, extracurricular activities, and a part-time job, all while maintaining a thriving social life. The principal of her high school said that Tynesha was one of the most driven students he had ever worked with. He said she had a plan and did something every day to make it happen. She wasn't shy about reminding the staff what they needed to do to help her succeed either. But her biggest goal was Texas A&M University. She wanted to follow in the footsteps of her uncles, but not in sports. Instead, she wanted to be a civil and chemical engineer, and she wasn't just dreaming about it. She was making it happen. Tynesha graduated in the top 3% of her class cum laude, and she earned multiple scholarships totaling $40,000, including the prestigious Linda Laurel Scholarship, which was only awarded to 15 students out of hundreds of applicants. Linda herself, the former KPRC TV anchorwoman behind the scholarship, described Tynesha's drive and determination as phenomenal. Tanya Driver from Texas A&M's Department of Multicultural Affairs recalled meeting Tynesha during an outreach event. In fact, Tynesha was the first student to show up so early that the announcement hadn't even finished. This was a girl with a future. This was a girl who was going places. And that's what makes this story and what happened to her so much more devastating. For all of Tynesha's confidence, her ambition, and her larger-than-life personality, there was one part of her life where she was still vulnerable, in love. Tynesha's first real boyfriend was Curtis, a handsome, well-liked, popular guy that a lot of girls at her high school had a crush on. But his attention, it was always on Tynesha. Curtis was the type of boyfriend who did everything right. He opened doors for her. He held her hand. He treated her like she was the most important person in the world. They were the kind of couple that looked perfect together, especially at homecoming, at school events, and pep rallies. But here's the thing about young love. It's passionate, but it's also unpredictable. Their relationship turned on and off for a while, and they had their ups and downs. But Curtis was always there. He loved her, he respected her, and he wanted the best for her. But during her junior year, something changed. While working part-time at Pizza Hut, Tynesha met someone new, Timothy Shepard. He was a delivery driver. He was nice, dependable, and handsome. And for reasons that even she might not have fully understood at the time, Tynesha decided to end things with Curtis for good and start dating Tim. The breakup was really tough on Curtis. He really loved Tynesha. And this thing with Tim, it wasn't just a casual high school romance either. It was more serious than that. Tynesha's family took a liking towards Tim right away, especially her mother, Gail, and her younger siblings. They thought there was a real chance that Tim and Tynesha were going to make it last. A forever type of love. He was quite charming. Tim didn't just date Tynesha, he really became part of her family. He was at their family events, he was hanging out at their house, spending time with her younger siblings, and her little brother and sisters, they looked up to him. Eventually, the two moved in together, and when Tynesha graduated from high school in 2006 and headed to Texas A&M University that fall, she and Tim decided to stay together and try to make the relationship work long distance. But there was one thing that nobody knew. Tim was 8 years older than Tynesha. He was 24, and she was only 16 when they first met. And you know what? She never told anyone. Maybe she thought it didn't matter. Maybe she didn't want to deal with all the questions, or maybe deep down, she knew that maybe not everyone was going to approve. But the relationship ended before Tynesha could even think about the future. Tim broke it off with her. They planned on making things work apart, but Tim's ex-girlfriend came back into the picture, and they got together, and Tynesha was heartbroken. But she was always moving forward. She had a vision for her own future, regardless of who was by her side. And when she went off to Texas A&M, her world opened up. For the first time, she was truly independent. She was surrounded by new people, new experiences, new possibilities. But as time passed, guess what? Tim realized he made a big mistake. He missed Tynesha and he wanted her back. He called it off with his ex. He traveled to Tynesha's college and he surprised her. She was, of course, very happy to see Tim, but definitely surprised. She had been talking to other guys by that time, and there really was never a shortage because Tynesha was naturally beautiful, and it was also her personality that drew people in. But she and Tim talked, and they realized there was still something there, so they got back together. While she and Tim tried to make it work long distance one more time, the reality was Tynesha was changing. She was growing. She was meeting new people, experiencing life in a way that made her question whether holding on to the past was really worth it. And that's when she met Mark, a fellow student at A&M, and Mark was different. He was her age, her pace, her energy, and while part of her still loved Tim, she also knew she wanted to experience college and other people. So after about 2 years of being with Tim, Tynesha made the choice. She decided to end things with him for good and started hanging out with Mark. But they were taking it slow. He was a friend first, and they were just enjoying each other's company more than anything else. But here's the thing. Tynesha didn't just cut him off. Sometimes that happens in breakups where you never speak to your ex again. But that wasn't who Tynesha was. She believed that just because love changes, it doesn't have to disappear. So she stayed in touch with Tim, just like she still talked to Curtis and other ex-boyfriends, because in her mind, love and friendship could coexist. And speaking of friendships, she made so many new friends in college. She shared a dorm room with Lindsay Steichen and a suite with Megan Wallace, two girls who quickly became more like sisters than just roommates. Megan said that Tynesha was the person she could always count on to brighten her day. And Lindsay, the one thing that stuck out to her was that Tynesha was unapologetically joyful. Tynesha lived by the saying, dance like nobody's watching, and she did. Everywhere. She even sang in the shower, even when her suite mates and their friends were around. She would laugh loudly, fully, without hesitation, and she didn't just go through the motions of college. She embraced every minute. At first, of course, Tynesha didn't know much about A&M's traditions, but it didn't take long before she was fully immersed in Aggie culture. She loved saying howdy to people on campus because at A&M, being an Aggie wasn't just about where you went to school. It was about who you were. And one of her other favorite traditions, the midnight yell. This is a massive pep rally that happened the night before home football games, and sometimes she and her roommates would head to Kyle Field to scream their lungs out with thousands of other students. But if they couldn't make it, they would actually hold their very own midnight yell right in their dorm room. Tynesha knew how to have fun, but she was also laser focused on her future. One of her psychology professors, Robert W. Birch, said that she had something that most students didn't. She had this openness and honesty that made her stand out. She participated in the class in ways that most students didn't. And by March of 2007, Tynesha was thriving. She had adjusted to college life. She had an exciting future ahead. And most importantly, Tynesha was happy. She was counting down the days to spring break. She was eager to reunite with her hometown friends back in Houston. And the biggest plan of all, she was going to see Beyoncé live, something that she'd been looking forward to for weeks. She was still seeing Mark, and they'd been planning this for a while. Her friends were all coming back home from college. It was going to be one of the best spring breaks ever. The concert was on March 15th at the Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo at the NRG Stadium, and she also had plans to travel to Padre Island for the last part of spring break and then return to campus. On March 14th of 2007, she was back in Houston, and Tynesha spent the evening doing what teenage girls do best, getting ready for the next day's festivities. She and her friends did each other's hair, they shared inside jokes, they laughed until their stomachs hurt, and caught up on everything they had missed while being apart. She spent the night at her friend Lois Greenwood's apartment, and that night, it was supposed to be a night filled with memories. But instead, it was the last time anyone would hear from Tynesha. Later that night, she called her mother, Gail, and she asked her, "Can I borrow the car for the concert tomorrow?" And Gail agreed. She was happy that her daughter was enjoying her break. But neither Gail nor Tynesha could have had any idea that this would be their very last conversation. That's when everything just stopped. First, it was the concert. Tynesha never showed up. But not only that, she wasn't at Lois's apartment when she woke up. There was no sign of Tynesha at all. It's like she vanished. And next it was her phone. Everyone began calling Tynesha to find out what was happening and where she was, but no one was getting an answer. And she didn't respond to texts either. She didn't answer calls. She didn't check in with her mom or anyone else. For some people, that might not seem that strange. Maybe she was just busy. Maybe she wanted space. But this was Tynesha. She was always connected. She didn't just go off the grid like this. And that's when Lois realized Tynesha's phone was actually still in her apartment. Now that was odd. Who would leave without their phone? Where was she? At first, they tried to come up with reasonable explanations. Maybe she stepped out for some fresh air. She's on a walk. Maybe she's with Mark. But she wasn't. And it was getting later and later, and the concert was that night. And that was the next sign that something wasn't right. She would never just skip the Beyoncé concert. These were plans that were made well in advance. All of her friends were concerned, especially when Tynesha never showed up. And by the next morning, Friday, March 16th, her friends were really worried. Lois got in touch with Gail, and she said she hadn't heard from her daughter since Wednesday night. And by that afternoon, her family knew that something was very wrong. And by the end of the day, panic was setting in. Her mom started calling everyone, classmates, friends, anyone who might have seen or spoken to Tynesha. Her sister Gayla was surprised that no one had heard from her, and she remembered something really eerie. A few days before this, Gayla had a nightmare about her sister. She even told Tynesha about it. In the nightmare, Tynesha was getting beat up by these jealous girls, and they actually ended her life, and they hid her body, and no one could find her. Of course, it wasn't real, and Tynesha told Gayla, "Don't worry, nothing is going to happen to me." But the fact that she was essentially now vanished, it's like the nightmare was coming true. Gayla decides that she's going to reach out to Tim, Tynesha's ex, just in case maybe he'd heard from her since she was back in town. When he was told that Tynesha was missing, he's like, "What? What do you mean she's missing?" Now, he admitted that she reached out to him on Thursday morning, but that was the last he'd heard from her. That would have been the morning before the concert. So now it seems like Tim might have been the last person to be in contact with Tynesha. So her family didn't wait another minute. They started their investigation on their own, with Gail going straight to Tim's, his apartment on Red Oak Drive, to speak to him face to face and gather additional information. Even though everyone in Tynesha's family liked him, that is in the beginning, as the relationship began to break down, they weren't as fond of him anymore. Neither Gail nor Gayla trusted him, and they couldn't really put their finger on exactly why, but it was just a gut feeling. They were both very protective over Tynesha, so it could have been that. But there was just something about him that made them uneasy, and now that she was missing, that feeling intensified. Once Gail got to Tim's apartment, she knocked on his door, and she wanted to know details about the last time he saw Tynesha. Tim explained they chatted the night of the 14th after she and her friends were done hanging out, and by 2:30 that morning, they decided they were going to meet up. He said he drove over to Lois's apartment, picked up Tynesha, and brought her back to his place around 3 o'clock in the morning. But he said while they were on the way to his apartment, she got a phone call, and he knew it was a guy, but wanted to know why a guy would be calling Tynesha at that hour, and Tynesha didn't want to talk about it. She planned to hang out with Tim that night, have fun with him, discuss it maybe in the morning. She didn't want to ruin their night. But once they got inside Tim's apartment, he said it turned into Tynesha just shutting down. What was supposed to be a good time reconnecting for the night and just hanging out, the two of them began bickering over the phone call. Tynesha wanted to table the conversation until the next morning, and Tim wanted to discuss it right then and there so they could resolve it and get on with their night. But what Tim told Tynesha's mother next caused a lot of concern. He said she left. That's right, she just stormed out of his apartment sometime around 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, and she left on foot, alone, in the middle of the night. Tim didn't even seem concerned at the time. There was no urgency to make sure she was okay. But it's true. She's from Houston. She's familiar with this area, and it's a safe part of town. Gail knew her daughter. She knew Tynesha didn't even like walking across the street alone. There was no way. She just walked away in the middle of the night. Something wasn't right. And by Monday, March 19th, Gail was filling out an official missing persons report at the police station. She provided the officers with a description. Tynesha was 19 years old. She was 5 feet tall and approximately 120 pounds, with black hair, brown eyes, and tattoos. There was one on her right hip. It was of her nickname Ty, another of an apple in the center of her back, and a butterfly tattoo on the left side of her back. She was last seen by Lois wearing a white shirt and rainbow-colored pajama pants. Her longtime friend Kenesha said that she spoke to Tynesha right before she went over to Tim's, and she even questioned her about why she was meeting up with him. Tynesha explained they were just going to hang out. They were just going to talk, get some more closure about the end of the relationship before she went back to campus. Her friends thought that Tim may have dropped her off somewhere all alone after they got into this argument with no way for her to contact anyone. So, of course, Gail expected the police to just jump into action, but instead, they kind of just brushed it off. They were like, she's a teenager on spring break. She probably just needed some space. Space? This wasn't a girl who needed any space. Gail knew that. She was supposed to be at a concert. She had classes to go back to. She had a life to live. And now she was just gone? A police officer just handed Gail a card. Can you imagine being a mother and they're just like, here you go. We'll look into it. That's what they told her. And they just sent her home. And it angered me when I heard this. She's a teen. I know she's legally an adult by law, but she's a teenager. She's only 19. She's alone. And days had passed, and nothing was happening. There were no answers. Tynesha's sister Gayla was particularly frustrated with the lack of action from law enforcement. She was trying her hardest to go through the proper channels, but it felt like no one was taking them seriously. As Friday turned into Saturday and then Sunday, Tynesha's family and friends became more and more worried. They knew the time was passing and it was critical. So Tynesha's family took matters into their own hands. They were actually into true crime. They watched enough episodes of shows like Dateline to know how quickly a missing persons case can turn into something way worse. So they were calling hospitals. They were calling jails. They called her old classmates, neighbors, anyone who might have seen her. And when that wasn't enough, they actually started to search the street themselves. They printed flyers. They knocked on doors. They went into wooded areas, even if it was dangerous. They went into bayous, even sewers, desperate to find any clue to Tynesha's whereabouts. Spring break was now coming to an end. They thought, was there a possibility she might have gone out to Padre Island with friends from college, forgot her phone, but surely she would have used someone else's phone to check in. So the wait continued. But when Tynesha didn't show back up at class at Texas A&M following spring break, their fears grew. Her loved ones were still without any police assistance. And so they organized a vigil at Abiding Word Lutheran Church to bring awareness to her disappearance. The community showed up in force. They handed out flyers. They were rallying for her safe return. It definitely got some attention that led in the right direction because Deputy JD, who worked in the Harris County Sheriff's Office Missing Persons Unit, received a call from his supervisor about the case. And he was instructed to go over to that church and see what was going on. The louder you are, the more you can't be ignored. Remember that. By the time Deputy JD pulled into the church parking lot, the scene was chaos. Tynesha's family and friends rushed over to him. Their voices were all overlapping. They were screaming. They were frantic. They were desperate. They were saying things like, she wouldn't just disappear. Have you checked with her friends? You have to do something. And through the commotion, one voice stood out, and that was Tynesha's cousin. She was yelling. She was last seen at Timothy Shepard's apartment. And they realized that his apartment complex was right down the street. So without wasting any time, JD got all the information, crossed the street, and knocked on Timothy's door in Unit 224. But there was no answer. The hallway was quiet until a neighbor said that they remembered hearing gunshots coming from the nearby woods. And this happened recently, like in the last couple of days. They were concerned that maybe Tynesha might have been injured or worse. So Deputy JD called in canine units to search the wooded area across from the apartment complex. Officers spread out with the canines' noses to the ground, and almost immediately, something was detected. It was the unmistakable stench of decomposition. 100 yards in, and the smell was stronger. 150 yards in, and Deputy JD was bracing himself. He was thinking, this is it. We're going to find her. But when they reached the source, it wasn't Tynesha. It was actually a dead animal. But for a brief second, there was this feeling of relief, but then it turned into dread because Tynesha was still missing. So the deputy returned to the church parking lot again, and he was swarmed with community members and nearby residents that were trying to provide clues, details, and tips. Someone that lived in Tim's complex said, "There was a fire in his unit a few days ago." Deputy JD was like, "A fire?" And apparently just days before Tynesha was reported missing, firefighters had been called out there to see what was going on. Neighbors had been concerned because there was heavy smoke billowing from the back of 224 for hours and hours on end. So Ponderosa Volunteer Fire Department responded to this call, and when they knocked on Tim's door, he refused to open it. A deputy finally came out, and they were banging like crazy, and there was still no answer. But then when he finally did answer the door, firefighters found him just cooking meat on his balcony. He was cooking on a couple grills side by side. However, what struck responders as strange was what they found inside the bathtub. There was a bunch of water and melting ice and more meat. They asked him, "What is all this for?" And he said he was thawing it out for a barbecue. The firefighter said that the cuts really didn't look like anything they'd ever seen before. They didn't know if it was ribs, chicken, sausage. They had no idea. There were also 3 small burned chickens sitting on Tim's stove. But they were called there for a fire, not a crime, and it wasn't a crime to be cutting and grilling meat in your own home. So they just left. And Tim just went back to his normal life, or at least he tried to, until more knocks came to his door. Then phone calls nonstop, and finally, Tynesha's cousin tells Deputy JD that Tim was on the phone right then and there, willing to meet with him. And it wasn't long before Timothy Shepard was standing right in that church parking lot. And to everyone's shock, this man was calm. He wasn't anxious. He wasn't panicked. He was collected and cooperative. But JD wasn't taking any chances. He wanted to protect him because this crowd was growing. So he placed Tim in the backseat of his patrol car, and Tim didn't protest. He didn't even ask any questions. He just sat there quietly, just waiting. And soon, 2 new faces arrived: Detective Sidney Miller and Captain Dennis Fields, a veteran investigator. This was their chance. They had the last person to see Tynesha right there. So they escorted Tim to the police station for questioning. But the moment Tim opened his mouth, they heard exactly the same story that he gave to Tynesha's mom. Nothing changed. He was completely composed, and he repeated that he picked Tynesha up from Lois's apartment in the early morning hours of March 15th at maybe 4 or 5 a.m. He admitted they got into an argument, but according to Tim, Tynesha left on her own accord. Just walked out of his apartment on foot with no explanation, no phone, and no car. Detective Miller considered the possibility that Tynesha might have been abducted by a stranger after leaving Tim's apartment. I mean, she was all alone. She had no way to get in touch with anyone. She could have been wandering aimlessly and picked up by someone. The thing is, the detective also knew, statistically speaking, harm more often comes from someone the victim knows. But with no body, no hard evidence, no witnesses, and not knowing what happened to Tynesha, Timothy Shepard was allowed to leave. He walked away as a free man. But as he did, Tynesha's family was still out there. They were begging for her safe return. Tynesha's family was hitting a wall with the police. The community was outraged by the lack of apparent action, and they also knew the media's bias. News channels often prioritized missing white women, and as a young Black woman, Tynesha's case sadly faced an uphill battle for attention. Tynesha's family was so broken, they really felt like nobody cared, and that is heartbreaking. However, her family had an advantage that many others didn't. Her uncles. They were former NFL stars. They had big followings. Jason and Aaron Glenn used their platforms to appeal for her safe return, to get some attention on her case. And that is when something shifted. Tynesha's sister Gayla got connected with someone who could make even more noise, Quanell X. Now, if you don't know that name, Quanell X is a civil rights activist. He's known for stepping in when Black families or other marginalized communities feel ignored by law enforcement. He becomes their voice. He had a reputation for holding police departments accountable. And when Gayla reached out, she was desperate. She told him that she knew in her heart that her sister was still out there, that she was still alive, and that she couldn't bring herself to entertain the possibility that she wasn't. She knew they needed to hurry. Quanell listened, and he stepped in. He promised he would do everything in his power to uncover the truth. As Quanell started to speak up about Tynesha's case, That's when police finally started to take it seriously. It's about time, right? It had been nearly a week since Tynesha disappeared. Detective Miller started taking a closer look at the 911 call that had come in 3 days prior to Tanisha's mom officially reporting her missing. This was the one about the fire at Tim's apartment. The caller, Lewis Evans, whose balcony faces Tim's, mentioned the smell was like burning hair, singed flesh. There was just something very unnatural, and the flames were so high, he thought it was going to catch the building on fire. Detective Miller went out there to speak with nearby residents. 18-year-old James Herbert told the detective that he and Tim, they played video games together, and they often grilled together on a number of occasions. So much so, James actually left his grill over at Tim's, and they would use it along with Tim's smoker. But on March 16th, James noticed that Tim was just grilling all by himself, and he wondered why wasn't he invited over. So he approached him, and Tim said he was catering for a wedding for extra cash, so James wasn't allowed to have any of the meat, even if there were leftovers, which was really odd. Since Tim was always very generous, he shared anything that he grilled. And he was also using James's grill. Clemencia Whitaker also recalled a smell that was so intense, it filled her entire apartment, and it reminded her of burning tires. When she said something to Tim, he said that it was all the spices that he was using, but she insisted it did not smell like spices, and it didn't even smell like meat. She had never smelled anything like it before. And then there was another neighbor, Ashley Smith, who mentioned something else. Tim had actually come over to her house for some favors. He wanted to borrow a broom, some foil, and some seasoning. Ashley didn't think anything of it at the time, but now it made her stomach turn. She told Detective Miller he didn't want me to go inside his apartment like I usually did. And when Ashley did manage to step closely inside that door frame through the threshold, she noticed the strong smell of ammonia and bleach. Later, Ashley said she saw another neighbor about to eat something off of Tim's grill, and she stopped him and she said, "I wouldn't eat that if I were you." There was something that just didn't seem right about it. But it was when Dion Whitaker said that she saw Tim carrying both of those barbecue grills to the apartment's trash area to dispose of them that Detective Miller thought, bit by bit, the pieces were starting to paint a very disturbing picture. With Timothy looking more like a suspect now, Detective Miller begins digging deeper into his background. He came from what appeared to be a respectable family with a good reputation in the community. His mother worked as a pharmacist, his stepfather was employed by Dr. Pepper, but tragically, Timothy's biological father passed away when he was just 2 months old, so we never got to really meet him or have a relationship with him. The Shepherd family regularly attended Greater Galilee Missionary Baptist Church, where his stepfather served as a deacon and his mother sang in the choir. Timothy also had a younger sister who was studying law at the University of Houston. This seemed like a close-knit family, and Timothy himself was a father to a 4-year-old daughter for whom he had obtained full custody. Those who knew him described him as quiet, reserved, and well-mannered. Neighbors who had lived next door to his parents for years told the detective that Timothy had always been polite and courteous. Another neighbor commented that he was a dedicated father who seemed to genuinely care for his child. But there was one neighbor that noted there had been some problems with Timothy over the years, but they didn't really go into detail. After high school, Timothy attended Texas Southern University and Houston Community College, but he never completed an official degree. And while it seemed like he led a relatively normal life, Detective Miller did uncover 2 prior arrests that hinted at least some trouble in his past. In 1998, Tim was arrested in Austin, Texas, for possession of a controlled substance by fraud. He later pleaded no contest to a reduced charge of a misdemeanor. Then in 2002, Tim was arrested again in Houston for possessing less than 2 ounces of marijuana, and he pleaded guilty to that charge. I mean, these were not major charges, and these offenses didn't directly connect to Tynesha's disappearance in any way, but I guess they did reveal a different layer to Timothy's character, one that maybe some people didn't know about. So Detective Miller decided he was going to make a visit to Tim's second-floor apartment, Unit 224. When Tim was being interviewed earlier, he provided written consent for the authorities to conduct a search of his place. And the moment Detective Sidney Miller stepped inside, he noticed 2 things immediately. The smell, a mix of bleach, ammonia, and then something else that he couldn't quite place. And then he noticed fresh paint. He didn't just smell it, he saw it. White paint, it was like it was a sloppy kitchen remodel, haphazard streaks up and down the cabinets, up the walls, even the door frames. And then the carpet had bleach stains all over it. There was a bunch of that plastic that painters put down to prevent paint from splashing around, dirty mops, a bag of latex gloves, and in every room, there was fresh paint. It was everywhere. It was too fresh and too suspicious. And then he reached the bathroom. It looked unnaturally spotless, almost like it had been really deep cleaned recently. The tiles had been scrubbed with ammonia, so much the floor was still damp, with the bottle right there under the sink. Even the inside of the sink cabinet was painted. Underneath where all the pipes are? Yeah, under there as well. The sink and the tub drain had been deep cleaned, as well as the bathtub. It was bleached, it was spotless, as if something had been thoroughly washed away for a reason. Crime scene investigators were called in, and they were swabbing for DNA and collecting evidence. But at this point, there was a lot more to be done in this investigation and nothing to hold Tim on. So it was back to canvassing the area and speaking with potential witnesses. But wait until you hear this statement. I have it printed out right here, this entire statement from one of the neighbors. This is what they told the detectives they witnessed on March 16th of 2007. Now, I have to read it to you word for word so that I don't miss anything. So I'm going to put something else up on the screen. But here we go. The witness said, and I quote, "On Friday, March 16th of 2007, I was at home on my day off. I woke up sometime after 11 a.m. and heard the sound of water coming from the bathroom from apartment 224. Because I lived here for a while, I can differentiate the sound coming from the sink, the toilet, and the tub. The water I heard was coming from the tub of apartment 224, seemingly running full blast. What was strange about this is that the water continued to run hour after hour nonstop. I remember one break when the water turned off. It was off about 5 or 10 minutes, and then it started right back up again. This was so unusual that I thought about contacting the front office and telling them that they may have been a broken faucet or something. I decided to let it go. People do not just leave their tubs running that long. I went about my normal business at home. I do not remember the exact time, but on this same day, I also heard a loud pounding. It sounded like pounding against wood or a table. It could have been the floor or a counter. I just don't know. The pounding was continuous for about half an hour. The noise sounded like it was coming from either the kitchen or the living room area. I heard things all the time from that apartment, so I just ignored it and filed it away in my mind. It started to make me suspicious. I remember when I went into my kitchen, I heard what sounded like the garbage disposal unit going on. This went on for about 5 minutes, and this is when it caught my attention. A person does not run a disposal that long. About 4:00 p.m., I left my apartment and decided to go on some errands. When I left, the water from 224 was still running to the best of my recollection. I went to Kroger's grocery store. After leaving Kroger's, I drove around in my car for a while and returned home around 8 p.m. By this time, the water had stopped. Later that evening, I noticed a metallic dark blue sedan parked in the tow-away zone in front of my building below my balcony. The car appeared to be a Lincoln or a Mercury. It was parked diagonally next to the garbage dumpster, which is right next to my apartment. There were other open parking spots, and I recognized this car to be someone who lives in the complex. I had seen the car parked in nearby spaces before, but never in the tow-away zone. The following morning, the car was still there. Around midday, the car was gone, and I thought, great. However, the car came back about a half an hour later and went back to the same spot with other spaces open. I saw a young black male in his 20s get out of the car carrying what looked to be a bag of fast food. I was standing on my balcony and I called out, "Buddy, that's not a parking spot." He looked around and said, "Is someone talking to me?" He said this in a timid way. I didn't say anything and just backed into my apartment. We didn't make eye contact. It must have had some effect because 10 minutes later, the car was gone. I have not seen it since. On Saturday, March 17th, 2007, or Sunday night, March 18th, 2007, I was walking to get my mail. I usually walk around the north side of the building along the sidewalk. There are 4 air conditioning compressors on this side of the building. As I was walking, I noticed that the air conditioning compressor of Unit 224 was running. This was unusual because it was a cool evening and this was the only unit running. As I continued around the building to the west side, I looked up and noticed the sliding glass door to the living room of 224 opened about a foot. The blinds were drawn, but they were moving as if a fan was on. Okay, that is the end of this statement. Wow. This resident really paid attention. They saw something and they said something, but it's more like they heard something, they saw something, they analyzed it, committed it to memory, and then told all. But cops weren't saying anything. They were remaining tight-lipped. But there was someone talking. Tiffany Shepard's cousin. I'm going to be telling you about that in a moment. I want to go back to this statement. I know none of us are going to think that we're going to see anything. But if you do, this is just an example of how someone can really help an investigation. This man, he knew something was up. The smells, the sounds, this wasn't normal. And if you hear something going on for a prolonged amount of time and it's not construction, it's probably something else, and it's worth maybe looking into it or calling the police. But I also know a lot of people who live in a multi-unit complex, they don't really want to get involved. Totally understood. But my point is remembering these things, maybe even jotting them down, could be really important. You just never know. But back to Timothy Shepard's cousin. He was talking. He was talking to the same man who promised to find Tynesha, Quennell X. On March 21st, Tim's cousin got in touch with Quennell. He said, Tim needs your help. Quennell was torn. He was deeply committed to finding Tynesha and uncovering the truth for her family. However, he also felt responsibility to ensure that Tim's rights were protected. Quennell had been vocal for a long time about his distrust of law enforcement. He didn't know if Tim was involved in any of this. The cops could be trying to pin it on him. They had him in an interview room for at least 10 hours at one point. So Quennell needed to get to the bottom of it. When speaking with those close to both Tim and Tynesha, they shed light on some of the more negative aspects of their relationship. Now, it might have started out great, but soon it was volatile. They argued all the time. And by the time she left for college, she confided in those closest to her that she was afraid of Tim. He was known as possessive, jealous, and controlling of Tynesha. He would call her nonstop, wanting to know where she was and who she was with, even when they broke up. Sound familiar to some of the other cases we've done? She was crying every day at college because Tim would even call her roommates looking for her and then leave them angry messages. That's quite embarrassing, especially for someone new to college, making new friends, and then you've got your crazy ex-boyfriend who seems to be harassing not only you, but people you just met. Tynesha's sister said that one time they were in the car together and Tynesha's phone rang, and when she picked it up, Tim got mad and he yelled at her, and then he started to actually physically shake her. And the thing is, Tynesha wouldn't open up as much to her family because she didn't want them to worry. But she confided in her roommates that Tim had choked her and threatened to end her life. And that happened about 1.5 years ago. He wouldn't let her leave his apartment. But since then, things had kind of cooled down. With her now being away at Texas A&M, Tim had stopped bothering her. That was until February of that year, so a month before she was set to come back for spring break. He knew that she was going to be in town, and Tynesha was worried that he was going to get all in her business, wanting to know who she was with and even maybe follow her around. She thought about not even coming back into town, but she wanted to have fun with her friends. She decided to appease him and attempt to just be friendly, hoping that everything would be okay. The truth is, Tynesha was still in love with Tim. Even though he wasn't good for her, and we've heard this before, he was convincing. And he convinced her to come to his place that night. The night that they met up, he was playing nice. He was showing his lovable side. He knew how to get his way with her. Quennell got on the phone with Tim, wanting to hear his version of events, and Tim agreed to meet Quennell at his apartment. But Quennell didn't want to go there alone. He thought it was only right to bring Tynesha's sister, Gayla, along. But she waited in the car as Quennell went up to speak with Tim alone first. Just give them some time to kind of be by themselves, man to man, and talk. When Quennell arrived, Tim was already shaking. His hands were fidgeting. His eyes were darting around his apartment. He was crumbling. Quennell asked if the cops had done anything to them. Had they hurt him? And he said, no, they just kept pressing me to confess. So Quennell embraced him. He put Tim in a hug, and he asked him, are you all right? And Tim just put his head down and he said, no, not really. And as Quanell walked inside, there were no words. I mean, just silence as he was glancing around at all the investigative measures that law enforcement had taken. There was black fingerprint dust on practically every surface. But when he entered the bathroom, Quanell froze. It was unmistakable. The entire bathroom was glowing blue, and if you've ever seen luminol light up bloodstains, this was like the bathroom had been painted with blood. It was everywhere. Before the luminol was applied, this bathroom appeared spotless. But now, all the hidden bloodstains were in plain sight. The floor was glowing, the walls, the shower, it was like pouring down in streaks. The tub looked like at one point it had overflowed with blood from the way that the luminol illuminated the stains. I'm actually showing you police footage of this bathroom and how it lit up. It literally painted a story of what happened. It was now undeniable. Something had happened there. Not just something deadly happened there. These stains, they were on the toilet seat, the tank where you would flush it. It was everywhere. You could sit there looking at this picture, looking at these video clips, and imagine every move. How someone tried wiping back and forth over the blood, just smearing it on the tiles. That's when Quanell looked at Tim and he said, tell me the truth. Do you know what happened to this girl? And Tim just hung his head down. Quanell urged him to consider Tynesha's family. They were desperate for answers, and he told him, don't prolong their suffering. If you know, tell me the truth. Quanell then asked the question that no one really wanted the answer to. Is Tynesha dead? And there was this long pause, and then the words that changed everything. Tim said, man, they're going to kill me. They're going to give me the death penalty. And at that moment, Quanell had his answer. Tynesha was gone. And Tim, it was obvious. He had done the unthinkable. But Quanell came there for answers, and now he needed to answer to Tynesha's family, and her sister was inside the car downstairs, waiting. I can't even begin to imagine both having to tell a family member their loved one is dead and being that family member whose hopes are just ripped away. The second Gayla saw Quanell X step out of that apartment, she just knew. He looked different. He looked like he saw a ghost, and her stomach just dropped. She's like, what did he say? And Quanell locked eyes with her, and there was just this silence. And then he said, Timothy confessed. Tynesha is gone. And that has to be so heartbreaking. Gayla could not even contain her sadness. She just broke down. It wasn't supposed to end this way. She knew Tynesha did not deserve this, and she didn't even know the worst of it yet. But now, just the two of them, aside from Timothy Shepard, held this crucial information. And Quanell sure as hell didn't trust law enforcement with this information because it would blow up. The media would be all over it. So instead of calling the police, he called someone he trusted, Jeff McShann. He was a respected reporter from KHOU. He immediately met with Quanell, and they decided to bypass the police altogether and contact the lead detective, Sidney Miller, and they told him Timothy Shepard knew where Tynesha's body was and to get there fast before he stops cooperating. Soon, Miller, Quanell, and Timothy Shepard were on the road, and following close behind was Tynesha's family members. Timothy directed them a few miles away to a dumpster behind another apartment complex called the Polo Club. And as they pulled in, his whole demeanor shifted. He was breathing heavy. His hands were fidgeting. He wouldn't even look at the dumpster. And Quanell could see it. He could see the signs. This was the crucial moment. So that's when he put his arm around Tim and he's like, it's okay. If this is where she is, where you left her, then it's time to give her family closure and tell them. But Tim hesitated. And then he just pointed and he said, there, that's where she is. Wow. And by now there were additional units on scene and they were starting to approach this dumpster very carefully and cautiously. They were bracing themselves for the possibility of finding Tynesha remains inside. With Timothy right beside them, they looked inside that dumpster. And to their shock and surprise, it was completely empty. There was just like remnants of a couple pieces of garbage in there, but there was no body. Either Tim was lying about where he left her, or the garbage had been hauled away and it was already at the landfill. And that meant the chance of ever finding Tynesha faded. But then they saw what was inside the bottom of this dumpster. There was blood. Enough of it to know that it was probably true that her remains had once been there. And at that moment, Detective Miller had heard and seen enough. He turned to Tim, he pulled out his handcuffs, and he clasped them around his wrists. He was put under arrest, and he was transported to the Harris County Jail. Now, there was another type of pain. Tynesha's loved ones did not have her body. They had no way to say goodbye, no way to bury her, to memorialize her. It was just a gut-wrenching moment. Her mom could barely walk without support. Everyone was emotional because they were left empty-handed. All they had was this unsettling question: what had Tim done with Tynesha? And back at the station, Timothy quickly invoked his right to an attorney, but then he changes his mind. And when he's sitting there all alone in that interview room, he makes a decision that shocked everyone. He asked for Detective Miller and he said, "I want to talk." Miller was stunned. He reminded Timothy, "You just asked for a lawyer. I'm not allowed to talk to you. I cannot legally proceed." But Tim didn't care. He's like, "I don't want a lawyer. I want to talk." And he did. For the next few hours, he confessed, and it was recorded. And what he revealed, let's just say that Detective Miller said they have an 80-20 rule. It means that a suspect will confess to about 80% of the truth about what really happened. And that 20%, you have to fill in with the evidence to find out what actually occurred. And it's usually worse than you can imagine. And in this case, I'm telling you, it is way worse. And I am going to get into that. But in that interview room, Tim said that he and Tynesha got into an argument about Mark. He said that Tynesha grabbed a knife that just happened to be sitting on his end table, and she swung it at him and she nicked his fingers. Now, he did have a small scratch on one of his hands, and he said it just made him snap. He put his right hand around her neck and he used the other one to try to grab the knife away, and then he just started squeezing and squeezing until she fell to the ground and she was no longer breathing. He said at first he was afraid that she was going to stab him, but then all the animosity for the argument they were in just came pouring out, and he just never stopped squeezing. He told the detective he doesn't know what happened. He was holding his breath, and then he blacked out. He was conscious, but he was having what he described as like an out-of-body experience. And I felt disgusted when he said that he knew he had to choke her. No, you chose to choke her. And that's if any of this is what really happened. But then he said he knew that police were going to be looking and figuring out that he killed her, so he placed her in a plastic storage container and threw her in that dumpster that he took them to at that other apartment complex. When asked, "Why didn't you just call 911?" he said he was scared they wouldn't believe him. And I call bullshit. And so did the DA, and so did the detectives. But at least Tim had admitted that he killed Tynesha. He was officially charged with her murder and held on a $250,000 bond. He then attempted to end himself in that interview room by placing his belt over his neck and then putting it on the door handle, but it was not successful. He knew they were going to find out what happened, and especially with who he did this to. Tynesha Stewart, a bright, ambitious young woman with her whole future ahead of her, and she was reduced to a trash bin. They realized that this dump is 500 acres. There's like 6,000 tons of garbage that goes there. So a search for her body could take them months, and it was also very expensive. They weren't even sure if they'd ever find Tynesha. But of course, her family was livid, as I'm sure I would be. Her sister said, "Would it cost too much if this was your own daughter out there?" And I would say the same thing. But here is the real horror. This was not the full story, and I know you know that. Because Timothy left something out. Something that, of course, he probably would have never admitted had they not figured it out themselves. Detectives finally pieced it together. I told you it was so much worse. They didn't think a search of the landfill would be necessary between the luminol evidence all over the bathroom, what witnesses said they smelled and saw. Detectives believe that Timothy did much more than simply put Tynesha's body in a container. Detectives and crime scene technicians went back over to Tim's apartment and they scoured the whole place. Outside on the balcony, they found pieces of what appeared to be burned hair and then a ton of these tiny little shards of what looked like charred bone fragments, and they were in the cracks of the wooden floor. And then they looked below the balcony on the patio underneath Tim's, and sure enough, they were able to collect over 30 pieces of these fragments to be DNA tested. Then they moved to that garbage disposal. They took it apart, and I could not even believe what they found. More charred items, more bone fragments. And then they found several pieces of teeth with enamel, and the entire garbage disposal was removed, and it was sent to the lab for further examination. This horrifying, absolutely just unbelievable evidence suggested that Timothy had put Tynesha into the bathtub, cut her, burned her body piece by piece, putting some of it down the sink into the garbage disposal, cutting it up through there over the course of 2 or 3 days. And you know he had been grilling. It was unbelievable, but it did make sense. And looking back, those strange pieces of meat that volunteer firefighter said he saw in Timothy's bathtub were in fact parts of Tynesha's body. He said that he saw a rack of ribs, but of course, in that moment, he would have never, ever considered it was a human body. But after DNA testing was conducted, it wasn't just a human body, it was Tynesha's body. And that is just beyond horrific. There's actually no words. I was trying to think of one. There are no words to describe what this monster did to her. Harris County prosecutor on the case, Carrie Sigler, had to explain to her family why there was no need to search for Tynesha's body. Can you imagine? And Gail just looked up and said, "Are you telling me that my baby is never coming home?" And Kelly was like trying to hold back tears. And she's like, "Yes, ma'am." And Gail just collapsed on the ground, and she was just saying over and over again, "My baby, my baby." Gayla couldn't understand the mindset of someone that loved you. You know, I even acted like they loved you, that dated you, and then cut you up in their bathtub. It just doesn't make sense. How can they make that switch? It's not human. She wanted Tim to be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. He needed to pay for what he had done. The case was now being handled by the prosecutor, Marie Prim, who was very experienced, and she was determined to secure a conviction. Tim was represented by Chip Lewis. He was a very successful defense attorney known for his high-profile cases, including the infamous case of Robert Durst. He was found not guilty, claiming self-defense in a case where, guess what? He had murdered and dismembered his neighbor. Yeah, so this defense attorney seemed to be the perfect fit for Tim's case. But he wasn't cheap. Luckily, Tim's sister footed the bill, and Chip was determined to challenge every piece of evidence that the prosecution had, focusing on getting Timothy's confession thrown out because he was arguing that it was coerced and that they didn't follow the legal procedures, all of that. And if that happened, if they were successful, this could mean they would get other evidence suppressed, like what was found in his apartment, and that would be crucial. That would make this case almost impossible for the state to win. But prosecutor Marie Prim fought back, and the judge denied the motion for exclusion, meaning all the evidence would come in. Now, I know some people leave after they know what happened, and they're like, "Oh, I don't really need to listen to the trial." I'm doing something new at the end of this video, so I would say keep watching. I would just say keep watching. There's going to be something different happening. But 28-year-old Timothy Wayne Shepard's trial began on September 29th of 2008. And in her opening statement, prosecutor Marie Prim outlined the details of the violent relationship between Tynesha and Timothy. She described the physical trauma that had marked their time together. And as she spoke about Tynesha's death and what Tim actually did to her, when she followed that up with the fact that DNA experts would testify that a tooth belonging to Tynesha was found in the garbage disposal, you could hear people gasping. Her family and loved ones, they were like crying out in the courtroom. There were tool marks found on those bone fragments. The evidence was overwhelming. You don't even need to be an expert to deduce what happened here. I'm sure all of you know what happened. And the defense strategy was to strategically get the jurors to separate Tynesha's death with what Tim did after she was dead, meaning the brutal way that he disposed of her remains. He wanted them to kind of just, that part we're going to not look at as being as important. He wanted them to compartmentalize, to focus on the strangling and the claim it was self-defense, kind of in a way saying she was already dead when the rest of the stuff happened. He stated, quote, "The details are the details. We can't change them, but the details are irrelevant as to whether Tim Shepard is guilty of murder. Nothing that happened after Miss Stewart's death changed the facts about how she died." End quote. So, in essence, what he was trying to do was minimize the effect of the horrific, barbaric, and just inhuman things that this man did to her corpse. Well, I'm going to tell you, it matters. It matters to me, and I'm not even her family member. It matters. Everything I told you was testified about in court by numerous witnesses, from Tim's neighbors to Tynesha's friends and family. Even Tim's cousin said that he once told him he could kill someone and get away with it because he would boil and eat them. That's just disgusting. Then there was the shocking conclusion to the state's case. Quanell X took the stand for Tynesha. He spoke the truth and kept his promise to find justice for her and her family. He testified to everything he witnessed Tim say and do and what he saw in his apartment. But wow, did this defense attorney put on the best defense money could buy. From saying that people lose their teeth all the time, suggesting that Tynesha's tooth just kind of ended up in the sink before her death. What? He even claimed that this man was actually the one in fear of little 5-foot Tynesha. This was countered by witnesses like a friend of Timothy's named Johnny, who said that Tim killed Tynesha because she refused a Valentine's Day ring that he wanted to give her. And he even jokingly, but I was like, this wasn't funny. He said Tim jokingly said if he wanted to kill her, he would cut her up, barbecue her, and feed her to dogs. How is that a joke? I'm missing the punchline because it's not funny. I don't get it. It's crazy. If you hear somebody say something like that, that's not normal. If you see something, say something. If you hear that, say something. After 4 days of deliberation, the jury, and you could probably guess this, found Timothy Shepard guilty of murder. And Tynesha's family and friends broke down in tears as Tim just sat there unmoved, emotionless, like the monster that he was. But now it was time for the punishment phase. And this time, Tim decided that he wanted to take the stand. He wanted to try to gain some sympathy from the court. His defense attorney didn't want him to do this, but Tim thought that he could convince everyone he didn't deserve such a harsh punishment. He wanted to go back home and back to his normal life. Well, of course, you know what happens when you go on the stand. It opens you up to being questioned by the prosecutor, and Prim didn't hold back. In the end, her questions forced Tim to reenact the way he grabbed Tynesha's throat, demonstrating it on the prosecutor, which was a pivotal moment in this courtroom. But the real intense part was when Tim admitted that he left his apartment, bought a jigsaw for the cutting, and even used pliers to remove her teeth. Yep, I can't even believe it. When Prim asked him if he then placed her on the barbecue pit, he actually stopped her and said, "Oh no, it was a smoker." So in those moments, he even needed to correct the prosecutor on the type of grill he used. This man got 99 years in prison, and it wasn't even the maximum, but it was his lifetime. Even though his auntie tried to say that, you know what, it's not his fault. It's not his fault that he turned out to be a monster. She was blaming his mother, that he had a hard life, that he never even knew who his real dad was. He found out after his dad died by stumbling upon his birth certificate, and he went crazy when he found out everyone lied to him. He thought his stepdad was his real dad. I'm sorry, but none of that excuses the vile nature of this monster. Tynesha's sister Gayla said that they could not even see the evil that was lurking all around them. They let that evil inside their home, near their loved ones, with no idea what this man was capable of. Gail reflected on her daughter's legacy, noting that Tynesha's name will live on, especially when Timothy Shepard's daughter applies for college, because there is a scholarship in Tynesha's name. And I was like, wow, that's right. This man had a daughter of his own, and he couldn't even imagine if someone did this to his own daughter. Now Tynesha's mom is dedicated to making sure other women don't die the same way her daughter did. She shares Tynesha's story in panels on healthy relationships and how to notice the signs that you are being mistreated. She said, "It's not a crime to get in your child's business. And yes, we respect their privacy, but we ask questions and we demand answers." And I have to agree. I remember seeing a comment on a video on my other true crime channel, Dark Livity. We did the case of Sydney Powell, who killed her mother, and someone in my comment section was actually blaming her mom for so-called snooping into her 19-year-old's business by having things like the Life 360 app. Well, I disagree. Yes, legally they are adults, but many teenagers and even 20-somethings, they still need parenting. And in that case, in Sydney Powell's case, her parents were still supporting her. So I think they had the right to know what was going on in their child's life. Not because you're trying to violate their privacy, but I mean, look what happened in cases like the Idaho case. Those university students, they were sent to college and they came back in caskets. So knowing where your children are, what they're doing, it's important for a lot of parents because it can save your child's life. But I think it begins with communication and having that open line of communication between you and your children. It's hard to develop and cultivate and build that trust so that they will come to you in confidence and tell you what's really going on. But if you feel like staying, because I told you there's going to be something different at the end of this video, if you want to hang out with me and continue to learn about a case that's been on my mind, I keep telling you there are these cases that I cannot do like an entire video on, but I want to share. I'm going to be doing a whole case right now. So if you want to stick around, I first want to thank you so much for being here for Tynesha's story. It's one that I don't think I'll ever forget. And then I hope that you will remember. And I want you to remember her for how amazing she was, not what was done to her. There are also resources below in my description box if you are experiencing mistreatment in your relationship so that you'll know what signs to look for. So please look down below. There will be links and numbers there for you. But okay, now if you are still hanging out with me, I wanted to talk about a crazy and heartbreaking story that has been on my mind for over a year now. Now, I don't usually just sit down and talk to you like a friend. I tell stories, I narrate what happened to people in their life, and I'm going to do that here. But I feel like a lot of times I don't get a chance to really just sit down and share with you things that I'm thinking or feeling or kind of have a discussion. I do check my comments. I read almost every single one of them if I can, especially if you come here in the first 2 hours. But there was this case that popped up. I think I first saw it on Law and Crime, and then it was like, no updates, nothing happening. I was checking in. I was trying to find out, like, what happened? There's always a question, and that's why I created this channel, because I would be left thinking, what are the details? Like, why aren't people diving into this? It's a case about something we all know too well, and I wish we didn't. And that is that appearances can be deceiving. What we see others post online isn't always the truth. If you were to scroll through Instagram, you would think that Carly had it all. This is a 26-year-old beautiful girl smiling in sunlit selfies, posing in bikinis on the beach, clinking cocktail glasses on tropical vacations. Carly Marie Perinelli was a woman from Victoria, Australia. She was a girl who loved her dog Coda so much, she had its name tattooed on her body. She was stylish. She had shiny blonde hair, piercing blue eyes, and a confident smile. She looked like the kind of girl who loved adventure, parties, and making memories. Her feed was filled with snapshots of her life, a cocktail in hand, standing on a rooftop bar, captioning, "Cheers to another year of being fabulous." A vacation in Bali, arms wrapped around her mom, writing, "Love you to the moon and back, mom." Party nights tagging friends, "Drinks on me, let's go wild." Videos of her and her besties celebrating with drinks and laughs. She's a lot like us. On the surface, Carly's life looked glamorous, exciting, and full of love. But we know better, don't we? We've seen this before. Think about Gabby Petito. Her Instagram was full of bright, sun-kissed moments, smiling selfies, road trips, breathtaking scenery. But behind the lens, that woman was hiding bruises that no one could see. Then she was taken from this world by a man that she trusted the most. There's Shanann Watts. How many people have done videos on her case over and over again? She posted gushing tributes to her husband, Chris Watts, smiling in family photos, calling him her rock, posting excited baby announcements. But behind closed doors, this man was plotting to kill her and their children. Social media lies. It's a highlight reel. We've heard it time and time again. It's never the full story. It tells you what someone wants you to believe, not what's actually happening behind the scenes. There was one person who appeared the most frequently in Carly's social media posts, and that was her mother, Joanne Perry. Joanne Perry was 53 years old and from all accounts, a devoted mother. Friends said they were so close as mother and daughter could be. They had a strong bond, posting heartfelt captions about how much they meant to one another. For Joanne's 50th birthday, Carly planned a special trip to Bali. She wanted to celebrate her mom in style, a mother-daughter getaway in paradise. She even went on Facebook travel forums asking this question. She said, quote, "Hey guys, so my mom and her partner and I are looking to head to Bali in the next month and haven't been overseas for many years. So looking to find one of the best resorts, even at $100+ a night, in the middle of Legion or Kuta," end quote. So clearly she's on this forum. She's asking people for their travel advice. And then later they do make it to paradise, and Carly shared photos of their trip. There were the two of them sipping on drinks on the beach, their toes in the sand, a birthday cake with candles, Carly's arm wrapped around Joanne as they laughed together. And to anyone watching, it seemed like a mother and daughter who just adored one another. But behind Carly's perfectly filtered photos, there was a secret growing. It was a dark, messy, and dangerous one. She was not okay. Carly was coming undone. She was unraveling. Friends saw it. Her mother saw it. Her ex-boyfriend knew, but no one could stop what was coming. Oh, and they tried. They did try. But there was another Carly, one who was in and out of the justice system, one whose mind was slipping into realms that many of us will never even understand. She would soon be described as a woman possessed, a monster. And it seems unbelievable when you look at her highlight reel. But on March 8th of 2024, that illusion was shattered forever. And by the time the truth came out, it was too late. But let's go back in time, but not back too far, just a few years before. Because there really isn't much publicly documented about Carly's early life, her education, or even her career. But her friends and family knew her as a person who they described as being happy and bubbly. But while Carly was posting filtered pictures of fun nights out, she was secretly battling legal troubles, mental health struggles, and substance use that led to a slow descent into chaos. By 2022, Carly had already been charged with a serious crime, one that completely clashed with this online image, a violent home invasion in Melbourne. She was accused of breaking into someone's home with violent intent. We're going to get to that. There was also the drug possession. Police found cannabis in her possession, and some might not think that's a big deal, but it was still a charge. It seemed like Carly did like to indulge in marijuana, and she didn't hide it. In 2020, Carly tagged her mom in a comment section of a Facebook post from the world of bongs. It showed a meme of a gravesite with cannabis plants growing out of it, and the caption read, "How my grave will look," and goals. Carly tagged her mom saying, "Next year, Cascade bottles and Mark's guitar," with a smiley face emoji. Clearly, this was a funny inside joke. And Joanne responded with, "OMG, haha." It seems like things that we would post to our family and friends. Then there was the intervention order, though, which is the same as a restraining order. Someone outside of her family felt so threatened, they were threatened enough by Carly to seek legal protection against her. And that's telling. And despite what her Instagram suggested, Carly's mental health was spiraling. She started posting cryptic, troubling messages online, messages that, now looking back, seem like cries for help. In January of 2023, Carly put out a post on social media for information on clairvoyance in Bali. She had been planning that trip for months, and her post asking for information on this Facebook page about Bali was actually met with a lot of ridicule. And that was because of her spelling, which is just, I don't know why people do that, but they'll be like pointing out all your grammar mistakes in a simple post on Facebook. It's not that serious, but also because she was looking for psychics. Okay. So she actually lashed back out at people and she said, quote, "Pretty poor comments. Everyone has their own beliefs, and that's that. I believe in psychics and I'm looking for a reading. Yes, anyone who doesn't believe in this can take all the piss they like," end quote. Clearly what she's saying is, you know what, you might not believe in the same things, but why are you being so mean to me? In essence, she believed in psychics and she wanted a reading. A month before this was when she posted in that travel forum, trying to find her mom the hotel accommodations. So this was all for that trip. And later, Carly did travel to a restaurant in Bali, and she met with a psychic named Stephanie. And she looked like she was having a great time and she was in good spirits during her trip. She even went back to that same Facebook page and she started posting recommendations about local drivers and other service providers. She even said, quote, "Highly recommend. Best massage I've had in Bali. Beautiful ladies and treatment," end quote. She posted on the same day, and there were beautiful pictures of her and her mom celebrating their vacation. But Carly's life began to spiral out of control not long after she returned from that trip. That's when the home invasion occurred. Why? It's really anyone's guess. Some have speculated that maybe she was having a mental break. She was paranoid, maybe she thought someone was out to get her. Others said it could have been to access drugs. Both are just speculations, but Carly wasn't the same fun-loving, bubbly girl her friends once knew. Something was off. She was snapping at people, she was getting paranoid, and getting caught up in one legal problem after another. And her mom, Joanne, was watching it all happen right in front of her, helpless to stop what was coming. It started with a breakup. Carly had been in a serious relationship, but by late 2023, it was over. And now breakups are hard for everyone, I know that, but for Carly, it really hit her differently. Friends said that she took it extremely hard. She wasn't just sad, she became angry, bitter, and she was spiraling out of control. And that's when the legal troubles came, the violent home invasion that I talked about. And let's be clear, this wasn't some minor offense. Home invasion is a serious crime in Australia, and Carly was facing real consequences for her actions. She was accused of forcibly entering someone's home with a violent intent. That means she was there to hurt someone. She was threatening the occupants. The exact details of what happened inside that house are not clear. They're not publicly accessible to my knowledge, but the case eventually did go to court, and most of the serious charges were actually dropped. But Carly wasn't off the hook. She was still facing drug possession charges and had a pending hearing scheduled for April 23rd, 2024. This wasn't just rumors anymore. There were now legal documents that Carly was dangerous. By early 2024, Carly's behavior was escalating. She wasn't just angry or erratic, she was losing control completely. On January 31st, she sent her ex-boyfriend Tyler Jackman a really weird text message. She said, "I can't deal with things anymore. I feel like so many games are going on, I just can't handle it." And at this point, Carly was desperately trying to hold on to reality, but it didn't seem like she was in a good headspace. She talked about how there was so much drama going on in her life and how she doesn't deal well with drama. Now, she and her mother had moved into a new 2-story brick home in Lower Plenty on Kett Street not too long before this. She even posted a video to Facebook showing her favorite part, the backyard, which will become very eerie later on when you look back on this post. It was a very quiet street with the homes pretty close together in a little nook. But it wasn't long before neighbors started hearing violent arguments from inside Joanne's house. One woman who lived on their street later said that she heard a lot of domestics going on for weeks. And at one point, the arguments were so intense, she almost called the police herself. But she hesitated. She wasn't sure if it was bad enough to get involved. We've heard that many times. I just talked about it. Residents don't really know if they should get all into someone else's business and call the cops, because that's pretty drastic, right? But you should. I'm saying you should. You're going to have your own thoughts and you can leave them below. But she wasn't the only one hearing things. Another neighbor later said they heard direct threats coming from Carly. She heard Carly yelling things like, "I'll set you on fire." Yes, she was apparently yelling this to her own mother. The neighbor was so disturbed by what she was hearing that she started warning other people in their neighborhood about Carly. Until this moment, Carly had always been seen as a lovely daughter, but it was like a switch was flipped. She was now appearing to be psychotic, and the neighbor even remarked, "When you're psychotic, you're not in control." She wasn't sure what was going to happen, but she knew it wasn't good. And yet, despite all of this, everything you're hearing, Carly's mom was unable to get the help that she needed for her daughter. She apparently told the same neighbor she was attempting to get Carly committed to a psychiatric hospital, but there were so many hoops to jump through, it was extremely difficult to do. This is an adult. If they're not willing to go get help, because maybe in their mind they don't need it, or there's other factors at play, it's hard to get them committed. The other thing is, Joanne loved her daughter unconditionally, but she was beginning to truly fear her as well. Carly was facing that upcoming court hearing. Remember, it was scheduled for April 23rd of 2024, which probably added to her stress. She had been severely losing weight, and even though she would post these very concerning but vague content online, she would also post normal content as well, like expressing love for her mom or excitement about plans she was making. But of course, all of this is looking back. No one is sitting there studying someone's social media posts in the moment like they do when hindsight is 2020. Carly did tell her ex-boyfriend Tyler that she actually hadn't spoken to someone in a very long time. And this was like she was being isolated, whether that was intentional, like she was withdrawing, or other reasons. And that's when he asked if maybe she wanted to get some coffee. Now, I don't know if they ever got that chance. By February 20th, Carly was shopping and she began having erratic behavior, and it got so alarming that authorities were called and she was taken to the hospital. She ended up being sedated because she could not be calmed down. She was apparently having both auditory and visual hallucinations. And I have to say, I was thinking, this poor girl. I mean, I know we haven't gotten to what ends up happening, but this is truly evidence that she needed help, one way or another. Police were called 8 times from just February to March 8th when things took a deadly turn. But each of these calls were for matters unrelated to mental health. It was over her driving, for criminal offenses, but not for her well-being. By March of 2020, Joanne knew that Carly was dangerous. She was begging for help, but the system failed her. Carly's behavior had grown even more unpredictable and concerning. For example, she expressed paranoia, desperation, and even alluded to harming herself or someone else. Maybe Carly was agitated. Maybe they had an argument and it escalated, or maybe she was delusional and she was perceiving things that weren't real. But on March 7th, Joanne called an ambulance for Carly. She told them her daughter's mental health was deteriorating rapidly. But when Carly heard her mom on the phone, she ran before the ambulance arrived. Think about that for a second. This mother was so scared for her daughter's mental health that she's calling emergency services only for Carly to disappear before they could intervene and she could get help. Now, at that point, Joanne was trapped. She loved Carly. She wanted to get her help. But what do you do when the person you love becomes violent? She probably thought, maybe I'll just keep the peace and everything will be okay. Maybe she just needs time. Maybe she'll get better. I don't think any mother really wants to think that they could lose their daughter. But when someone's mind is in another place, it's like you've already lost them, which is really sad. And there was no getting better. Carly was on the edge, and within 24 hours, everything was going to explode. The very next day, Friday, March 8th, Carly returned home. Now, Joanne welcomed her back because that's what mothers do. Now, it might have been an ordinary day leading up to that evening. Joanne came home from work, from errands, and Carly came back sometime that day, but within hours, Joanne would be begging for her life. The screaming would start. The neighbors would rush to their windows. The police would be called. The neighbor had referred to Carly as a ticking time bomb, and she was right. But if you had driven by that house that afternoon, you would have thought that nothing was wrong. It was a quiet, ordinary street, a mother and daughter inside their home. Maybe Joanne had hoped that things would be okay that night, that maybe she had some time to calm down. But Carly wasn't calm. Something triggered a sudden eruption of violence in that early evening, whether it was an argument between mother and daughter, a psychotic break, or on Carly's part, a combination of those factors. But around 6 p.m., a neighbor heard the screaming. And it wasn't a normal argument this time. It was pure terror. It wasn't just one scream. It was a steady stream of screaming and yelling. And the words weren't clear at first, until 4 words cut through the air. Joanne screamed, "Don't set me alight." The neighbor now was fully alarmed, and they ran to their window, and what she saw made her stomach drop. Carly was in the backyard, the same backyard she once said was her favorite part of their home. And she was kicking and spraying her mom, Joanne, with an aerosol can and a lighter, as if preparing to set her mom on fire. That is so terrifying. And then minutes later, at approximately 6:30 p.m., that neighbor made a call that would send police rushing to that scene. 2 Victoria police officers arrived very quickly, and they could already tell something was horribly wrong. They could hear the screaming and the commotion, and they looked over the fence into the property's backyard, and they saw a large pool of blood on the ground, and saw Joanne face down with her daughter on top of her, cutting her neck with a knife. They immediately called for an ambulance and climbed over the fence to get in the back part of the property. And Carly was still on top of her 53-year-old mother with a knife in her hand, stabbing her over and over again. This wasn't a single act of violence. It was a frenzy. Joanne was being attacked. She was being butchered. And Carly seemed like she had no idea these officers were even there. The officers immediately pulled out their guns and they shouted, "Drop the knife!" Carly was in such a violent rage or in a disturbed state, she didn't even comply. She continued plunging the knife into Joanne as police officers were announcing their presence and commanding her to stop. They kept yelling to her, and for a split second, Carly hesitated, and the knife slipped from her hand and fell to the ground. But then, out of nowhere, without warning, Carly picked the knife back up, and she was told to move away. But instead, she went back to her mother, who was most likely already deceased by this point. She began stabbing her again, and she wasn't stopping. And that's when gunshots rang out. A neighbor later said she thought the shots were maybe warning shots. They weren't. Police had opened fire on Carly. This was a kill shot, 8 of them to be exact. And within seconds, Carly collapsed to the ground and was bleeding out. The officers rushed in, they secured the scene, they checked Joanne's body, but it was too late. Joanne Perry was dead, and so was her daughter Carly, lying only a short distance away from her mother. The backyard that Carly once loved had become a massacre site at her own hands. She never got to explain why she did this. She never got to face a trial for her crime. Paramedics arrived in 10 minutes, but there was nothing they could do. Joanne had suffered catastrophic stab wounds to her neck, multiple deep wounds, likely severing arteries, and to her torso, and even defensive wounds and deep lacerations all over her body. She was pronounced dead at 6:52 p.m. This wasn't just a stabbing, this was actually overkill. I know you've heard that word many times. Someone's already deceased. Someone keeps going. It was terrible. And this location was now an active crime scene with 2 deceased individuals. Victoria police didn't hesitate to call this exactly what it was, a homicide, and then Carly's death was a police shooting. And it was ruled a necessary police shooting. I'm going to be talking about that in a minute, and I'm sure you have a lot of your own thoughts and comments that you want to make, which I completely welcome. But forensic technicians recovered the bloodied knife that was used by Carly, and they noted other evidence of a struggle. They saw signs of a fire or an attempt to start a fire at the scene, scorched material or an accelerant, and this supported the claim early on that Carly had tried to ignite something. By the next morning, as you can imagine, the news broke. There were headlines everywhere. Mother murdered by daughter in a frenzied stabbing. Police forced to shoot young woman in a suburban backyard. Mental health crisis ends in bloodshed. I mean, they went on and on. I saw them, like I said. Law and Crime did a video. And of course, this community was shocked. And so were these women's loved ones. There were so many questions about why this beautiful young woman who once adored her mother ended up taking her life in broad daylight. Why did she do it? Then came all the speculation. Was she on drugs? Was this some kind of psychotic break that was untreated? Some people even suggested it was undiagnosed schizophrenia. Should she have been in jail instead of out on bail? And these were all good questions. And there were, of course, varying degrees of both sympathy and anger. But one thing everyone agreed on, this tragedy could have been prevented because all the signs were there. Carly was slipping. Joanne was begging for help. Neighbors were hearing threats, and no one did anything that truly kept them safe. And then came the ridicule. The public wanted to know, why did Carly have to die? And I want to pause because I want to give a thought or two, and of course, I want to hear yours as well. But I did wonder that. Police are in high-pressure situations. I understand that. They are trained to act fast. This happened in 60 seconds from the time they saw the scene to reholstering the gun. So that decision was made very fast. And I wondered, could it have been too fast? Joanne was most likely already deceased when the cops arrived, or shortly afterward, as Carly got off of her mother and dropped the knife. But could the cops have thought in that time frame, that small time frame, that they weren't sure, that they didn't have time to assess the scene, that they didn't know if they were still in protection mode for Joanne? But on the other hand, if Joanne was already dead, then making sure Carly was detained and went to trial for a crime should naturally come next, not killing her. But some may argue things like, well, she could have come after the cops, but she had a knife, they had guns. There was enough distance and power in their guns to render her immobilized in seconds. We know that. We saw that, right? It happened in this case. So that argument doesn't really make much sense to me, but it's one that the cops are going to make later. Some ask, why not just shoot her in the leg? If you're worrying about her coming after you, why not just shoot her but not kill her, but make her fall down, maybe not use deadly force? Well, cops are trained to shoot to the torso, the biggest part of the body, the heart, to ensure they make a shot. But it's a valid question. Why kill her too? Others said good, that it was justice done, that no one wants to pay taxes or keep her fed and clothed or roof over her head in jail because she's dangerous. Like, who takes their own mother's life? But that diminishes the possibility of getting people help. What if she was schizophrenic? What if she was not fully in control? She was 26, and it's usually diagnosed between 16 and 30 years old. So Carly was still in that age range. If on the right medications, Carly could have lived a normal life. But she was a murderer now. She would have probably not seen the light of day again if she would have survived, unless a jury truly believed, with the evidence, that she was of truly diminished capacity when the crime occurred. But from the very limited evidence, maybe she was. She was in a trance-like state. She wasn't even aware police were there. And in Australia, anytime police officers discharge their firearm, it triggers an automatic investigation by the Professional Standards Command. A coroner's inquest was done into these police actions because when an officer kills someone, no matter the circumstances, there are always going to be questions that need to be answered. Luckily, these officers were wearing body cameras, and it showed that this was absolutely necessary. Those were the words used by authorities. It was absolutely necessary. Victoria Police Acting Superintendent Scott Coulson, he told the media, speaking the very next day, that the officers faced a terrible dilemma and had no choice but to shoot to stop the attack. The two officers both discharged their firearms, and they were turned over for ballistics analysis, and they both had to undergo immediate drug and alcohol testing. That was standard protocol in a police shooting. They were also placed on temporary leave while the investigation went through. But not everyone agreed that this was a necessary and warranted killing, especially when the superintendent confirmed that Joanne was deceased by the time of the shooting. In essence, the police arrived in time to witness the killing, but not in time to save their victim. There were some people, especially in these online debates, who questioned things like, why guns at all? Why didn't you just use tasers? The police had a response. They didn't have tasers. They said that Victoria Police did not issue tasers to all general duty officers, meaning that non-lethal options were not available at that moment. And she was carrying a knife and being erratic. They also did comment about shooting in the leg, which I thought was interesting. They said, this is not Hollywood. It might look easy in a movie, but shooting someone in the leg, while they're moving around, it's not really a real life strategy. And the final ruling was that this was justified. And I saw everything. I saw people saying she was a monster, she's a murderer, police had to do what they had to do. We have no sympathy for someone who stabs their own mother. But other people believed that this was a failure of the system. They said things like Carly was clearly sick. She should have been in a hospital, not out on bail. This was preventable. Joanne tried to get help, but no one listened. And Carly's ex-boyfriend, Tyler, spoke out publicly. He said she wasn't a monster. She was let down by the system. She needed help, and she didn't get it. When he posted a collage on his Facebook page, he said, I wish it wasn't true, but unfortunately it is. R.I.P. Carly Perinelli. Hopefully see you again someday, wherever we end up after this crazy thing we call life. Until then, I'll have to settle for all the good times we had. End quote. And many people were quick to offer condolences, but there was one commenter that spoke out against Tyler's perspective. He said, not a monster? It takes a special type of grub to defend someone that stabs her mother to death. She wasn't let down by the system. What a fucking cop-out. She's a product of her own decisions, and it's nobody's fault but hers. What do you think? I would never be that harsh, ever. Someone just lost their loved one, someone that they knew personally, and who knows who this guy is. He might just be like a random troll. But since Carly did not survive, obviously no charges were filed in Joanne's murder. Normally, a suspect like Carly would have been arrested at the scene and charged with murder and even arson. But here, when a suspect dies, that process doesn't go forward. And I know that not everyone's going to see the police officers as victims, but the superintendent did make a statement about how the officers were dealing with everything. He said that they were feeling it tremendously. They don't go to work expecting to draw their firearms and be involved in these sort of tragedies. And I mean, they are human. They did have to witness something so traumatic. But I was surprised that there wasn't actually more publicized about this case, and I get it. Both of them died. It's tragic. But it doesn't really provide closure for the community when no one gets to the bottom of why. And then the debate continued online. And that was because of headlines like the one about Carly's dark past, that gets everyone talking. But it was really just what I told you, the home invasion and the drug possession. After weeks of media attention, Joanne's extended family finally broke their silence. They released a statement through Victoria Police that said, "We are devastated by the loss of Joanne, a loving and caring mother, and Carly, who battled her demons." And then they asked for privacy. But their words told a story about a girl who was, as they said, battling her demons. But they didn't just lose Joanne. They lost Carly too, and they cared about both of them. And this won't be the last case like this unless something does change. We're going to see another Carly, another Joanne, another preventable tragedy, and that's what makes it terrifying to me. Because Carly's story, it could be happening somewhere right now. Someone who is hiding behind all the smiles and clinking glasses on social media. I talk about these cases because I want us to be aware of these haunting examples of familial violence. It's relatable. It's heartbreaking, but it's relatable. This was a mother-daughter relationship that ended in the unthinkable. How do you deal with a loved one, especially an adult child who seems to be slipping away mentally and emotionally? I don't have the answer. I don't think there's one solid answer in cases like this. I think it's specific to someone's personal experience. But it is scary to hear about people like Carly and people like Sidney Powell. I told you, John and I did a deep dive about that on Dark Livity. Check it out next if you want to. But as a mother myself, it's terrifying for me to think that my child would be capable of that. And of course, I would want them to get help. For me, having a 13-year-old, they're dealing with a lot. They're dealing with a lot more pressure with social media. They're dealing with emotions and even knowing things that we didn't know at that age. And it is hard. But I told you this story because I wanted to have a conversation. I know this isn't a live stream where we can connect right now in the moment. I want to do that in the future. I said I would do it when I hit 500,000. So if you haven't subscribed, please do so and share my channel because that's a personal goal of mine. I do want to start having more conversations with one another. But for now, I want to hear about what you think about this case and what you think about social media and the impact it has. So are you ready to uncover the answer to that mystery from June's journey? The secret word is footprint. Now, if you look closely, there is a muddy footprint on the carpet near Claire's body. But whose is it? Was someone else there that night? If you want to continue solving the mystery, download June's Journey for free on iOS, Android, or PC by using my special link below or scanning the QR code on the screen. And thank you so much to June's Journey for sponsoring today's video. And until next time, be safe and please be respectful in your comments. See you in my next case. Bye.